I loved being in the woods from the time I was a kid, but I didn't know crap about it. You can't take a step and not be walking on food.
What did people use ragweed for?
Cultures that eat a lot of foraging stuff, even in Appalachians where they do it out of poverty, out of necessity, they don't have those food allergies. All of that is a function of lack of diversity in our plant diets from an early age.
How difficult would it be to hunt, fish, and forage a whole year?
I quit hunting about 8 years ago, and I still have a freezer full of venison at any given time, just picking up roadkill.
So you're foraging your venison?
Oh, yeah.
That's unbelievable.
In the Ozarks, people have always lived in rhythm with the natural world. Hunting, fishing, living off the land aren't just things we like to do, it's who we are. And though our lives are inextricably linked to the land we live on, today we've never been more disconnected from it. So join us as we travel across the region, bringing you the voices of the Ozarks, deepen our connection to the land, sharpen our skills in the outdoors, and learn what it means to be an Ozarker. Welcome back to the Ozark Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Veit, joined by my good buddy and co-host of the show, Kyle Plunkett.
Yes, sir.
You're sitting real close to me, man.
This is just how it had to happen to get us both on camera, it seems.
Sounds good.
Such a cute couple.
Thank you. We appreciate it. We have got a very special guest on this episode here today, and this is about a month or two ago, we did an episode on foraging, and we referenced this individual a couple times at least in the episode we did with Tim Hammer, and that is none other than Mr. Bo Brown, who is the author of Foraging the Ozarks, Falcon Guide book. He teaches a wilderness school. He's a musician. Spending just the last hour we spent with him, a wealth of information and knowledge. Tell the folks what we just did in my backyard, walking around.
Well, we just went on a foraging walk in your weeds.
In my very normal neighborhood.
Yeah. And ate all the species but one, maybe. The poison hemlock. All but that.
Besides the poisonous ones.
It's a compulsion at this point. I can't not do it.
You just go around eating everything you see everywhere you go?
Pretty much.
It's impressive. There wasn't a plant out there that you didn't know.
Well, that's, like I said, years of OCD and, just falling in love with the thing and diving in. And
yeah. Well, I'm excited to spend some time with you here. We are going to be talking about your background and how you got into foraging and wilderness skills and all the things that you do. And I also want to really get into some of the historical significance. I've started your book. I'm about halfway through it. And I love how you start the book with the history of food and how many different species of plants there are that are edible, but how few of those today we actually consume as humans in our diets and how that has changed over time. So I want to go into all those little pockets. But before we go there, let me just ask you, how did you get into the world of foraging and how did you become the expert that you are today?
Well, the expert part was, like I said, just persistence and just being plumb eat up with it, as they say here in the Ozarks. But my introduction to it was my earliest memories. My mom grew up in southeastern Arkansas in cotton country, and they were fruit and cotton pickers. So they were at the bottom of the economic ladder, and so the Depression hit and they had to move up to Yellville, Arkansas area to a little town called Bruno, and all they could get their hands on was a subsistence farm. They were going to try to raise hogs and grow a garden, and the land they ended up with was a gravel hillside with scrubby trees and nothing else, and there were just nothing to eat there. They were starving to death. And so I guess my grandma and grandpa, wherever they came from, I don't know their histories, but they apparently knew enough of that stuff. So my mom taught me probably a dozen plants or so that she liked her greens. She liked poke greens and lamb's quarter and curly dock and all that stuff. And then when the summer fruits come on, blackberries, persimmons, pawpaws, all that, she'd have to go out and pick it, and she'd make pies and whatnot with it. And so earliest memories were with her, but she didn't have a deep knowledge, but it was definitely a part of the culture she grew up with, and that she passed that on to me. Then about age 14, I discovered drug, sex, and rock and roll, and so I was off into another world for a long time. But during my early musician days, ended up playing in a band with a fellow, Don Brink, who's still very active in this world, doing this kind of stuff. He does a lot of stuff with the Springfield Nature Center and does stuff on his own. But we were backpacking at the time, and we just started, trying to get more and more into the wilderness type stuff. But at the point we were gearheads, and every time a new stove or a new tent or something else, we were, and pretty soon we're lugging 50 pounds of crap in the woods. And then, I think it was around 1976, I was playing, I played several seasons out at Silver Dollar City, the theme park outside of Branson. And I think one of the first years I was out there, they had a flint knapper, a guy chipping arrowheads, a native guy named Jim Fire Eagle. And
that's a sweet name.
Oh yeah,
very cool name.
And he had hair down to here, and just he was the deal. I mean, and so I saw that, and I'd collected arrowheads as a kid, and didn't even know people still knew how to do that. And so I just camped out at his feet, trying to absorb as much of that as possible. And there were a lot of people that knew him because he'd been there before, years before I got there. And every now and then somebody'd throw a plant in his lap and ask him about it, and he'd go on for 5 minutes. I mean, there just wasn't a plant you could show him that he couldn't tell you something about it. And that really got Don and I both into it. And so we started, incorporating that, and just everything I'm doing in my life now, other than music, which I was doing at the time, I really owe to his influence to getting me to look deeper into the woods that I loved being in the woods from the time I was a kid, but I didn't know crap about it. I didn't know trees other than a few plants that my mom taught me and stuff, and didn't really have a reason to learn it until I learned out how much of it is, you can't take a step on anything green unless it's a sprayed lawn like you get out here, but you can't take a step and not be walking on food. And I'm still, every week or every month, I learn a plant that either didn't ever make it into the foraging literature, or it's something that I knew that wasn't considered edible. Sometimes they were considered to be toxic, and for whatever reason, they got that label and nobody ate them. They're not toxic. They're perfectly fine. They're just might not be the best flavored. Then the trick culinarily is mixing those plants that nobody eats with other stuff to where that flavor makes whatever it is you're eating just really pop instead of, you don't eat a whole salad of arugula. So you don't, the idea is get as many different plants into a salad as possible. But we talked about that earlier, about how the history of our plant diets. And I cover this thing in a whole seminar called Wild Food versus Industrial Food. So it's, if you look at hunter-gatherers, they're eating hundreds of species throughout the year because everything has a window, very short, sometimes a window of a few days. Right now, they call them spring ephemeral wildflowers, things like toothwort, spring beauty, waterleaf. There's just a whole big list, trout lily, and they're only there for a couple of weeks, and if you don't catch them right then, you've missed your opportunity. So as the season went on, they would have eaten, like I said, 100 or maybe even 200 species of plants. At the point where agriculture started and people wanted to have more of a control over their food supply, they tried to take those same plants and, plant them in gardens and control the growth on it. But a whole lot of that stuff would not grow outside of where its habitat. There's little micros, like what they call them, microhabitat or soil biomes. A lot of that is created by fungus, by the they call it mycorrhizal network of just threads that all fungus, when it grows in the ground, spreads out and connects to tree roots and plant roots. That actually changes the soil a bit to make it where it's more, some plants prefer that type of soil. So that's why you just get little spots of it. But anyway, it's just, we were eating all these species, and then we took those and tried to put them in a garden, and they just didn't do well.
Right.
So we went from eating hundreds of species to dozens.
Yeah.
And
now today, the average person probably at best consumes, 20 to 30 different kinds of vegetables.
Not even that. And then if you start digging in a little further, if you go to the store, you buy cabbage, you buy kale, you buy Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, just there's ever growing list of plants. You think you're getting different vegetables, and you look into it, but those were all bred from one species, Brassica oleracea, and I write about that in the book in the mustards. But this is pre-Roman times that they selectively bred a different. I mean, they focused on a different plant part each time. So the kale is just they worked on getting a bigger, fleshier leaf. Cabbage was the little terminal flower bud. The broccoli was the upper stem and flower buds. Kohlrabi is just a big fat stem. Brussels sprouts were the lateral stem buds that goes up the flower stalk. And it's all from one plant. Brassica oleracea was the species. And so people get all these different vegetables thinking they're getting different stuff, and you're getting one plant.
Oh, wow. Goodness.
So a buddy of mine out in California, he does foraging walks in the produce aisle and talks about plant families, because that's the key. I mean, look at how many different families of plants you consume, and it's ridiculously low.
Yeah.
And you remember I was talking, I don't think it was you, I was talking about I had 34 species of plant in one salad in my property.
Right. Just on a nature walk.
Yeah. And I broke those down into plant families, and there was over 21 or 22 plant families. And half of those you could not buy in the store anywhere. There's no representation that you could, unless you went to a specialty seed store to, native, seed store or something like that to plant it. You can't buy any of that stuff in the, in a store or in a market or anything like that.
So do those different plant families that now we don't really have access to go buy in a store, do those offer different nutrients and things that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise?
Oh, yeah. Every single one of them. And for every... if you look at any plant that we've been eating, anything that you can buy in the store as a result of anywhere from 200 to 10,000 years of selective breeding to get it bigger, sweeter, more mild, easier to process, all these selective pressures that we put on them to make them what we desire in a crop. In fact, there's a cool kind of a documentary film called The Botany of Desire. It was based on a book. And but it talks a little bit about that kind of stuff. But it's just about how we've pressured plants to make them what we want, which is bigger, juicier, and every step of the way you're diluting the medicinal compounds, all the things in there that are cancer fighting, immune system building, vitamin, density, nutrient density, all that. You're trading all that for sugar and water.
Yeah, because I would think, naturally, what I think of in a really tasty veggie is, big, juicy, and sweet. I want like a sweeter vegetable. And when you go out and you taste some of these wild foods, they have a bitter flavor. But is that something that I am just accustomed to that flavor now, and so that's why I prefer sweeter things? Or
like I said, we've had 10,000 years of getting sweet and mild to condition our taste buds to that's what we prefer. So, when we taste a really strong plant, it's disagreeable. Where we taste something bitter, and if you get tons of times, I've heard people that move here from Eastern Europe, where they desire those really bitter mustard greens. They're so bitter they'll take your head off in one bite, and that's what they love. They love that bitter greens, and those things that's a lot of times those bitter elements are anthocyanins, polyphenols, all these phytonutrients that are containing the cancer fighting agents and the what do they call them, adaptogens, which are things that modify your body one way or another to help. Mushrooms are really good at that, just being medicinal things that just help in so many ways. I read a thing recently about all the rash of plant allergies. Why everybody's allergic to everything from milk to peanuts to very specific things like the red in red tomatoes. They can eat yellow tomatoes, but red tomatoes make them get a reaction. And from what I can gather, all of that is a function of lack of diversity in our plant diets from an early age. And they looked at cultures that eat a lot of foraging stuff, even in Appalachians, where they do it out of poverty, out of necessity. They're like my mom, they knew that stuff from an early age. They supplement their diet with all this wild stuff. They eat a lot of wild game, because that's what they can afford.
Right.
And they don't have those food allergies.
Yeah.
And the cultures that eat a lot of that stuff.
That makes sense. I mean, thinking about, raising our kids, you're trying to expose them to so much early on just to figure out what they are and aren't allergic to. And if you can expose them to as much as possible, you at least know, or you can condition them to not be allergic.
Yep.
So it makes total sense.
I'm gonna put us on pause real quick, Kyle, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So we're sitting here with the man he wrote the book, Foraging the Ozarks.
The book.
This episode, primarily, we're trying to get into the what, the why, and the how in Foraging the Ozarks.
Yes.
The what is easy. Food. Foraging. Right.
Yep.
The why, which we've just dipped our toes into, but I want to dip into more, is why is this important? Why is a more diverse diet important? All that kind of stuff. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the how. But the reason I wanted to set that up before we went any further is if you're anything like me, you're going to be maybe on a stream bank trying to catch a fish. And if you're like me, you're, like you've already said, tromping on food without even thinking about it because you've never been educated as to what it is and how to get it, how to eat it. And so we hope this is like an intro companion guide to the average Ozarker who's going, I'm out in the woods, I'm out by the rivers, I'm doing whatever I do, but I also want to figure out the what maybe even the species is, what it does for me, how I get it, and then how to find it and then what to do with it after. So hopefully that's a little bit of a framing that helps.
Yeah.
Since we just, deep ended it, which I love. I love when we jump into topics like that. But
it's hard because I can tell just talking to him, Bo, you know so much.
Wealth
it's
of
like,
knowledge.
Man, I gotta say, I gotta tell all this information, and I don't want to stop you because you got all the good stuff. Let me ask you this: you were starting to go here, and I wanted to ask, and thank you for framing that up. Within the Ozarks, and you just mentioned poverty in places like Appalachia, where a lot of this came from necessity, and this is just what was around, and even before that, Native Americans, this is just what the food was. It wasn't like a thing that
there weren't
you did.
stores. No.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What is the historical significance of foraging wild food in the Ozarks specifically? What's the history here?
Well, like I said, it was born out of poverty because the people a lot of times were trying to get further west from, they was getting crowded in the east. They were wanting to go to the promised land, and some of them, this is as far as they got. And, they talk about the myth of the lazy hillbilly. That's bunk because you had to work to get a living out of this hard gravelly ground. There's just not much soil here. So that isolation also attracted a lot of people to it because they didn't want to go out to California where everybody else was going. So that's why a lot of the early white culture stopped here. And like I said, there was a lot of interaction with Native Americans that were the ones that were still here. What we know from the plants here were the base of knowledge from Native Americans that they were, more often than not were, ready to share all this stuff. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they weren't ready to share because they saw the writing on the wall and they would tell, you can eat that, but it was toxic, or something.
Yeah,
play tricks
go
on
for
it
it.
and stuff. Yeah, but there's because they could see, kind of where things were coming with people coming into their land and then pushing them out. So, but they, like I said, every book and everything I do, I try to make it a point to honor their dedication to, because they knew it intimately. I mean, they knew it like the back of your hand, better than that.
Right.
But I mean, it's everything in the world is there. That was your food, your shelter, your medicine, your spiritual well-being. I mean, just all of it was just right there. And then this new culture comes in that tells them that's, no, you need to be here in this spot and grow these vegetables and be like us and, try to wipe out their whole way of life.
What were some of those, some of the foods that are still around today that would have been a primary food source for like Native Americans or early people that we don't even see when we're walking through the woods or, when you're walking through the backyard? What are some of those things that you can identify that is like, this used to be a staple, but really nobody even knows about it much anymore, or it's not that prevalent anymore?
Yeah. Oh, gosh. A lot of the native plants, there was one called Apios americana. It's called groundnut. And it's just something that people have forgotten about, but it makes a real nice, it almost looks like a string of pearls. It's got a little rhizome little rootlet, and then it'll be a swelling like a big bulb of a potato, and then another thread, and then another swelling, and on like that. So that was one that was a staple that apparently it was a lot more common whenever, they were here. I guess they encouraged it and probably planted it wherever they went. And,
Right.
We think of Native Americans as just having all this knowledge and going out into the wilderness and just collecting the bounty that was already there. They did a ton of management, a ton of horticulture, of bringing stuff, as they were out, they were covering the whole countryside, hunting, fishing, doing other activities, and foraging and bringing stuff into a central location. And then they would, just from being there, processing seeds, throwing them out. So there's a lot of movement and plants getting to places that they didn't exist before just in their activities. And so it's just, a long-term effect of making the land more productive that they were doing.
That's important because people think that humans are removed from nature, and the more removed, nature's a separate thing than humans' encouragement of it, and that's just never been the case.
Yeah,
humans have always been intricately connected to nature.
Yeah,
and Native Americans stewarded it better. Most likely.
Yeah.
Actually, we can say that for a guarantee
at
this point.
Yeah.
But
when we get into the sustainability part, there's a whole thing about the sustainability of ethical foraging that relates to that very thing.
But it's cool to know that they're encouraging hunting grounds, controlled burns. They know what's good food, so they're finding it wild, but also encouraging the growth of that. Like the fact that even trying to learn on this topic, thinking about how I'm wanting to learn more about foraging, and it feels like this just unknown world. It probably felt like original settlers coming in, and it felt like an unknown world to them.
Yeah.
But the natives, it's their native language. This is just how they lived, what they did. It's crazy how history can circle around like that. Where now we're going, or at least me, and I know others who are interested in this world are going. We kind of want to know how to live off the land around us and not have to buy everything out of a store, or have to live the way that modern society tells us we have to, and that's neat.
And that's why the ethical and sustainable part is all important, because it is getting so popular. A lot of the stuff that is edible are native plants that a lot of times they don't grow just everywhere. They got a very specific habitat needs. You're only going to find them in a certain area. I see people that collect rare plants, and I saw a whole hillside of it, so I took a whole big bowl full of it home, and yeah, but great. But look at the range map of that plant. There's only 3 counties that plant occurs in. So you got to really bore in and know a little bit more of it. And I tell people that it's just like it's very important to learn the plant's name, which is its Latin name. That's its true name. Every plant has a Latin name that is, you can have 5 common names to a plant. And, you call something pigweed here, and you go 3 counties over, it's something different, and you go 2 states over, it's something different. So it's all these common names, and there will be anywhere from 2 or 3 to half a dozen names people call something. But if it has a Latin name, that's its name.
That's the one to key in on.
Yeah. And
to give that example, we were just walking in the backyard, and you pointed out, here's a ragweed, and you said this is actually in Latin. In Latin, it was ambrosia.
Yes.
Is that right?
Uh-huh.
Which is funny because ambrosia translates to, what did you say it was?
Food of the gods.
Food of the gods, and then we call it ragweed.
And it's hated. Everybody hates it because it's, gives you allergies.
And so that just highlights like 2 completely different names and I would say like, food of the gods sounds really good. Ragweed, not a good name.
Yeah.
You're not going to want to eat that.
Food of the gods sounds like something you go out to find.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not ragweed.
Not ragweed. But we ate that, and it was good.
Yeah.
Like, you would put that in a salad, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And but what they harvested was the seeds and the male flowers, and they're like 47% crude protein, the seeds of ragweed.
Wow.
They, like I was telling you earlier out there, that was so important to Native Americans that as part of the Eastern Agricultural Complex 4,000 years ago, they were selectively breeding that plant to get larger seeds so they could boil them for oil and stuff like that.
What did people use ragweed for?
Mostly the seed. They used the female seeds, which are a pretty good sized seed, and they also used the male flowers. And I think the seed they determined was 47% crude protein, which is higher than wheat.
It's a ton.
Yeah, and so they were doing that, eating the greens, probably as a boiled green. Maybe, they didn't eat salads back then, but they probably trail munched whatever is along there. So there was that, and another one called Iva annua that's marsh elder. And those two plants, they were mostly for the seeds, and they selectively bred those over several thousand years. This was about 4,000 years ago, and got one of I think the Iva annua marsh elder, they got it 5 times larger than the parent variety. Then they just quit doing all that stuff because probably corn got there, and it was much better, easier to grow and get a lot more. For whatever reason, they quit growing it, and that big seeded variety of that marsh elder went extinct. So the only place to see those large seeds are in the archaeological record from 4,000 years ago.
Really?
But the ragweed got reincorporated, the genetics from that big seed got reincorporated into the parent variety, and so you just find every now and then you'll find a big giant seed that you could probably trace it back to being selectively bred somewhere in that Eastern agricultural complex. That a buddy of mine is a archaeobotanist. He studies plant remains from archaeological sites.
Oh, that's cool.
Wow.
And so the stuff he's looking at, it's like, you can't even hardly see it, just little grains, but it's charcoal plant remains dug out of archaeological fire pits. And through a microscope, there's a key that you can identify the cellular structure and get it to plant part and to species from the thing that is. And I come up to him, and he's in the lab looking at this stuff, and I'm looking, and I can't. I said, "What are you doing? Picking fly shit out of black pepper or something like that?" You know, it just looked so tiny that he could. I couldn't. But he was the authority on that stuff, and it just so that opened up a whole new field of me to learn new plants that didn't make it into the foraging literature about learning what the Native Americans were using. So it's like I said, it's such a cultural thing that goes back to the first inhabitants of this area. And I worked as what they call it, a shovel bum, a contract archaeologist for Center for Archaeological Research out of Springfield for over a period of about 10 years. So I worked on over a dozen digs, and so got to hang out with Neil, Lopino. Dr. Neil Lopino is the guy. He's retired now, but just opened up a whole new aspect of learning about the far back cultural aspect of what was being eaten here in the Ozarks.
Based on your research, what kind of, I'm just curious, Native Americans, what were their typical eating patterns as in terms of when they ate, how often they ate? I mean, for us, it's so common to think of breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 3 meals a day. But then, you're talking about kind of trail munching and eating this here and this here. Was it just a continual process based on what we know, or how would their patterns have differed from ours?
Well, they didn't have meal times, probably, other than a big dinner whenever they found something. But it was all on what you found. Sometimes there were, you're living in the land of plenty where there's a lot of stuff. Other years you're scrapping and, really trying to find every little scrap that you can get. And there's a lot of what they call, survival foods. They didn't like it that much, but you eat what you had. And so, but I nobody knows because they've not really, talk to the individuals about, when did you eat breakfast?
Sure.
Did you eat lunch? Or, and there may be knowledge out there about that, but I assume that they ate when they were hungry, and they ate when the food presented itself. And then I assumed that they would, after a day of activity, they'd all come in and have kind of a communal dinner or whatever.
Yeah. I can picture the same as, you're out hunting, and I even picture, a day where you and me are out turkey hunting and we're going through the woods or we're scouting. There's points and periods where you're stopping, you're taking breaks, you're looking around. We're usually looking for morels and things like that. And when you find some, I can imagine how you just go ahead and eat it right there and do your thing. And then if you got a turkey at the end of the day, you might have a big supper at the end of the day.
Yeah, but you wouldn't want to eat a morel out in the field.
Just straight up?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, all wild mushrooms need to be cooked. Native Americans, from what I can gather, did not eat a lot of mushrooms for food. They consider them more medicinal. Protein-wise, there's stuff there, but there's way more medicinal content. And I think I suggested this, but my buddy Mike Snyder, who's a big mushroom expert up in the Raleigh area, He does a whole program on medicinal mushrooms, and it's the science on that about what medicines are in mushrooms it's just blowing up right now. We're finding out how critical that is to health on all levels. You remember Otzi, the Iceman that they found? They found he had some dried mushrooms on a piece of rawhide hanging off his belt. And I think they were turkey tail mushrooms, which are a medicinal mushroom.
Really?
Yeah, they're adaptogen. They're immune system building things. There's plants fungi like the reishi mushroom that has been studied in Chinese medicine for 5,000 years. And they over there they called it the mushroom of immortality.
Whoa!
Because the Chinese guys ate it, and so all the Native Americans they ate them, but they didn't concentrate on that as a food source because. You can throw them in the soup or something like that, but they didn't have skillets and frying pans. They did fry, when they could extract oil from seeds like they did with the ragweed and the ivanua. And they could also boil acorns and skim the oil off the top. Mm-hmm. Like, we got white oak and red oak that are just large groups of different types of oaks. The white oaks are the ones that they would leach and make the acorn flour with to make like a hardtack type of bread. We think of bread as this big, fluffy, spongy stuff. Mm-hmm. That didn't exist until we had domesticated wheat with a high level of gluten. So when they speak of bread pre-colonial times, it was hardtack kind of bread with no gluten, and so it was like flatbread type
like
stuff.
A power bar.
Yeah.
And, would it be like I'm thinking pita bread in my head.
Even that's got the bubbles from fermentation from the gluten in there, so this would be more like crackers.
Oh,
something
it's dense.
Like that.
Yeah, interesting.
And in the Grasslands book, I even cover one that's called breadroot, and it's more. It occurs in Missouri. It's just a little bit north of the Ozarks, but it was a staple of the Lakota. In fact, from evidence they can find, they've routed their bison hunts around area where that plant was very plentiful, and they collected tons of it. And when the settlers started coming across the prairies, moving west, they'd have the big trade. What do they call them? The big trade rendezvous, and where they'd bring this stuff and barter and stuff. So Native Americans collect these roots and sell them or trade them to the settlers for things they wanted, and not knowing that settlers had, they'd been driving over this stuff for 200 miles to get where the natives were selling it to them. They didn't know what the plant looked like, but it was, like I said, it was critical to their survival. It was one of the main things. They could dry the whole root, and then when they wanted to eat it, they'd pound it into a powder, then add a little bit of water and bake it on a hot stone.
Wow.
So
that's cool.
Fascinating.
Are the Ozarks, pretty rich place for forage foods?
Probably one of the richest places
That's what I was
in
the
ask, country.
Because
yeah.
you're talking about how some areas are going to be sparse or some are going to be more diverse. We're like the breadbasket, right?
Absolutely blessed for
the
wild
place.
food, yeah. Because, we got all the eastern deciduous forest stuff, which if you go east of here and get into, Kentucky, Tennessee, all the way down to northern Georgia, all the way to Appalachians, and that's a lot of what's in the Ozarks book are those generalized plants that are in that kind of habitat, moist, rich slopes, hillsides, river valleys, that kind of stuff. But we also butt up against tallgrass prairie, so we got things like that are on the cover of my book, which is the they call them ground plum or milk veg buffalo pea. It's in the pea family. It's a prairie plant, and so we have influence from the prairies in our glades and open areas and stuff like that. So it's like a combination of it's an ecotone of those two habitats, and so we get the richness from both. Plus, we've got areas, and there's a segment in the front of the book called the Ozarks, the physiographic region. And I did a whole thing about why geologically the Ozarks were formed and what made it such a rich botanical area, because the just geology of the place and how it was formed. And we got karst topography that produces tons of springs and clear rivers, and there's fens. It's spelled F-E-N. And it's like a spring, but it's one that seeps out of the ground, usually at the base of a hill. And those things will host they call them glacial relics, which were plants that are nowhere else in this part of the country. You got to go to the Canadian Shield to find those, but because it's cool and damp, they hung on after the glaciers retreated. So
Still now.
Still now, yeah.
You can find glacial relics.
Yeah, they're called glacial relics, and like I said, they're usually in fens and stuff like that. There's a whole class of them.
What kind of
wild.
plants would those be? Like what's an example of a glacial relic?
Oh God, you would ask me that. I'd have to get out there's a Rare Plants of the Ozarks, a little book that came out years ago.
Okay.
And, but yeah, you're getting into the deep
Some pretty
weeds of
specific stuff.
botanical
Okay.
lingo to get into those. But they're not commonly known plants,
Yeah.
and they're all endangered, so you don't want to go picking them or
You
anything.
gotta go eat them.
Yeah. So, cave entrances will harbor some of that kind of stuff. They weren't food plants for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
They were just a lot of tiny little things, orchids, specialized habitat things that, just like I said, only have that one little spot.
Yeah. And so you just mentioned endangered plants, you don't want to pick those, and you talked about earlier kind of ethically harvesting and ethically foraging in a sustainable way. Why is that important? In my mind, I could make the leap myself, but I'm thinking, these plants they're wild, they're native, they're everywhere. They're going to pop up if you pick them again. But is that not the case? Can you really wipe out a hillside?
Well, depending on what you're after.
Okay.
If you're digging roots, which that's one of the first things I cover in my classes or in any kind of conversation about doing this stuff. Digging roots on any public land is illegal because you are killing the plant. Now, there are a lot of plants. If you're on your own land and you're after the roots, you are killing the plant when you do that. But I showed you how they did if you're picking a bulb plant that's got little bulblets off the main bulb, they would plant that little bulblet back in the ground where they dug the initial bulb out. So there's ways like that to preserve the plants. That plant I was talking about, the breadroot, and I just found this out a few years ago, how the Lakota harvest it is when they dig the thing out of the ground, they leave the top attached. And it looks like a lupine, which you get out west, the big, beautiful blue flowers with the 5-fingered leaves, and it's a real hairy plant. But anyway, they would dig the whole plant out of the ground with the top intact. Then when they cut the root part of it, they left about 3/4 an inch of the taproot attached to the top. They would bury it upright in the hole that they dug in, and then the flowers would go ahead and mature, drop seeds, and the seeds were something like 50% more likely to reproduce in those plants than the ones where the seeds fell out on compacted ground.
Wow.
So that's the aspect that the conservation department in their prairie management and a lot of people on prairie management are missing the boat in the fact they want to just burn the prairies to get the new growth in. You do have to have a minimal amount of disturbance, just like the bison would come through, eat a little bit, move on.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't stay there and eat like cows do. They ate a little bit here, a little bit there, kept moving.
Yeah.
And so that little bit of disturbance allows those plant seeds, especially forbs, vascular plants and stuff like that aren't grasses, to be able to get a toehold. Otherwise, the grass thatch will just build up, and nothing else can penetrate that.
Yeah.
So that's the aspect. And a lot of the regenerative agriculture now, that's what they're doing. They're using sheep, goats, pigs, whatever, and doing a very high rotation rate on them. So they'll take electric fencing and fence off an area, and they'll move them every 3 or 4 days. And then after they've been on there a little bit and kind of beat the ground up, then they'll come back and sow it with these native plants and prairie plants and grasses and stuff. And it takes a while, but you can turn a piece of just totally abused ground that's been over pastured or over harvested, overcropped or whatever is in there, and turn it into productive prairie. And it will, if you keep doing it that way, it's self-maintaining.
Wow. And
that's where you get these big, long, prairie grasses grow these 10-foot long. If it's in soil, they get these enormous root systems, which are better carbon sinks than forests. I mean, they talk about planting trees for the carbon capture and all that. So that's another aspect of the whole climate change that people want to, they want to clear out all that stuff and put in fescue, which doesn't have those root systems to do all that. So
you were telling us about this a couple of weeks ago, talking about carbon sinks, and you educated me on it because I had never heard heard of what you were talking about with grasses being better than forest, but it's the same.
The right kind of grass.
The right kind of grasses.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
That movement, the regenerative agriculture movement, I just see it everywhere on my social media. It's on the TVs. There's documentaries about it. I'm curious how that overlays with the foraging world. And do you seek out places that have been treated differently and kind of had these regenerative practices done on them to go and find different types of foods that maybe aren't available in other places?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, I don't seek them out because it's, if somebody's doing regenerative agriculture, that's usually private land that they don't want people tromping out there to take all their, whatever it is they just planted.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, you're going to find more diversity, and a lot of the stuff they're planting is going to be not just animal food, but human food. Mm-hmm. And, but that's the two big movements that are happening right now that do kind of give me hope, is a lot of people are planting native food forests. Mm-hmm. So an area that's, it's been in an apple grove or, some kind of plant that Europeans have brought over. Once that's played out, then they come in and plant all wild plums and persimmons and pawpaws and, sow the ground with and just kind of prepare it where everything out there is producing some kind of food or pollinator food or, host plant food, whatever. And so it's a way of looking at the earth as just a big giant mosaic that we're just a part of. Mm-hmm. We've always looked at it's us and in nature.
Yeah.
Like you said earlier, there's no, the used to be the definition of wilderness is a place that man hasn't set foot in. That's bunk. Every plant out there has evolved with us and animals and everything munching on it. And that's something I cover. We were going to get around to about the ethical foraging, is that if you're doing it right, you're mimicking what the animals do. And which, if you're eating greens, you're going to get the little tender, they call it meristematic growth, or the meristem, which is the actual green part that's pushing out and growing new stuff. That's, the key words are young and tender. Mm-hmm. When you're anything, whatever you get, you're going to get the top tender part of it. Well, on bigger shrubs and even vascular plants, it's just like trimming your mint. When you trim a whole bunch of the ends off of the stems, what does it do?
Grows more.
It splits and it grows more. So if you do that quite a bit on it, it stimulates the plant it will actually double the amount of reproductive parts that it will produce. So you're making that plant produce more fruit than it would have if you hadn't picked on it, because there's even a name for it. It's called herbivory overcompensation. So when herbivores are munching on a plant and eating away on it and eating all the goody parts, then it responds by splitting and making more. And I've got shrubs of things like spice bush that are close to my property, close to my building where I teach my classes, that just out of convenience, it's the closest ones there. And I'd break the limbs out all the times to use for pit baking, where I'll break the whole limb off with the leaves attached, get a big deep bed of coals, put about a 3-inch layer of those spice bush leaves on there, put your food on top of that, put another 2 or 3-inch layer on that, and then put all the big embers back on it. Mm-hmm. So the same shrubs that I've been breaking, just really devastating, because there's so much of it, but that's the close one. And I come back, and that thing is just gigantic, bushy, luxurious thing. And the ones further back in there, they just get tall and spindly, and they just don't even look as healthy.
Yeah. So
so that's another aspect of the foraging, that you're not overdoing it, but you're doing what nature does. And there's some basic rules that that some people say never take more than a third. I say more like a fifth, because if you take a third and then somebody else comes along, there's this much, I want to take a third.
Right.
All of a sudden, there's not much left, and there's other stuff. Everything that we eat out there, there's other things that want to eat that. And same with mushrooms. There's entire insects that live in mushrooms that their entire life cycle depends on that mushroom. So if you go out and pick morels, and you pick every single one, even the old dried up ones and stuff, and don't leave anything out there, there's a insect that might not make it, and they're all integral to the life of these plants. A lot of them, they can't make it without these things.
Yeah.
So it's all interconnected, and we just have to find our place in there to do it right, and not You know, I say you can't live on the planet without making impacts, but you can be aware of your impacts and make them positive whenever possible.
Absolutely. There's a quote that says, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the parts. And it's, you think about taking something apart that's got a lot of pieces. When you finally do try to go put it back together, you hope you hadn't lost the piece that actually ends up being super important. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And in nature, it's the same thing. We don't really always know the ecology of all the plants and animals and how they interact. We think we have a good idea, or there's science out there, but sometimes we just completely wrong.
Yeah.
And so to get rid of something that could be integral in the health of our systems and throw things out of balance would be.
Well, that's the whole thing about endangered species, is that a lot of times they don't even know what ecological role that thing plays. Mm-hmm. But when you remove it, all of a sudden you've got a whole chunk of things that goes haywire. Mm-hmm. Somebody said it's like an airplane. You can pull a rivet out here and a rivet out here, and you keep pulling rivets out. Pretty soon, eventually something bad's going to happen. And we're doing that with our native ecosystems. We're just people just from being unaware in human activity. It's nothing is good about what until people get educated about what's going on out there, and just learning ecology, basic ecology, and I tell people not everybody's going to have the willpower or whatever it takes to go as deep into plants as I have, but you can just become aware of stuff in your own backyard and get to know it. I tell people in my primitive skills, I started teaching that stuff in '93. The reason, the ulterior motive for all this kind of stuff was, you can make cool tools and weapons and stuff that might save your butt in a pinch, but every aspect of that, if you're going to make a basket or you're going to make a bow or a bow drill fire or anything like that, there's almost always a specific wood or a specific plant or something that's going to fill that purpose. Then it makes you focus in on learning its name and learning about it. And then pretty soon you're starting to amass a knowledge. You're seeing all this as a whole that's like, you don't look at a forest. We're really good at compartmentalizing things and looking at a field and say, well, that's a field. I don't need to look at that any further.
Right.
Once you learn all the little things, the magic things that are going on in there, that we just don't see in our everyday lives, then you find out, there's food, there's medicine, there's clothing, there's just everything, there's fire, there's everything we need to live in that field or forest. And it just makes you look at the natural world in a new way.
Yeah, the natural world really is more magical than we like to think it is. But I got two questions for you that I hope are easily answerable, but I also know we could spend a long time on them. So try to keep it high level enough if you can. I was told growing up, this is by parents who want to make sure I don't do something dumb and kill myself. Like, hey, don't pick things in the woods and eat them unless you know exactly what it is, which is great advice.
Yeah.
However, my question is, if you could, in large swaths, think of the Ozarks, what percentage of forageable, findable food is edible, and what percentage is potentially like detrimental? And I know there's going to be a gradient there where there's some middle. It's like, you wouldn't want to eat it, but what are the
I wouldn't want to put a
percentages?
number on it, but it's way, way, way more plants that are edible than that are toxic.
Okay.
There's a tiny, small handful of plants that'll actually do you in.
So if you're a gambling man,
and one of them's right out there.
But they do. There's one out there.
There's one out in your backyard.
That's the poison hemlock.
And poison hemlock probably kills more people than the other plant, only because its similarity to wild carrot, which is also Queen Anne's lace.
So if I went out there and I ate that, what would happen? I mean, would I have to eat a lot to do me in?
Of the greens, I always read that the root, 3 to 4 or 5 small bites of the root can kill a person.
3
to 4, 5 bites.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
So it's and it also depends on your makeup at your time.
Yeah.
It depends on the stage of the plant. All of it depends.
Wow.
But the general consensus was that the greens weren't as toxic as the roots. And yet some 15 or 20 years ago, they found a woman dead in her apartment, I think in New York, where she had the remnants of the salad that she ate was still there. She didn't eat all of it. And they determined that she had about probably 15 little pieces of the ends of that leaf of just what you got growing right out there that she had thought were wild carrot tops, and she put them in her salad. And from the remnants of the plant, they estimated she ate about 15 or 16 little leaf fragments.
You gotta get rid of that, bro.
Yeah.
Get that out of your yard.
See, Bo, this is what gives me a little bit of nervousness about trying new stuff.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I know that I will never die but if I don't eat anything, I can never get sick from eating stuff. So what would you say to someone like me who's got that concern but is curious about foraging?
Yeah. Well, like I said, that is one family. That's the carrot family. The actual name is Apiaceae. It used to be umbelliferae because all the flowers make like an upside down umbrella, but they've changed it a while back. But a lot of books advise anything that remotely looks like that, just avoid it when you're learning, because that's and it, like I said, there's another plant that's even more toxic than that one. It's water hemlock. It's a different species, but it's actually more deadly. This one has about I think a 20 to 30% fatality rate from people that eat it. The water hemlock's like 50 to 60.
Oof.
Yeah, it's really toxic, and how they kill you is really fascinating to me. I just learned this a while back. Is that the poison hemlock interferes with the electrical impulses between your brain and your motor functions. So basically, you have organs shut down and failure, and you just kind of go out. So the whole story of Socrates. He had to choose his method of execution, and he chose that because he knew it would be an easy out.
Really?
And you just kind of fade out and go to sleep and die. You cramp up, I'm sure. But water hemlock, on the other hand, the thing that regulates that electrical flow, that's what it interrupts. So when people die from that, they spasm so hard they break their own bones. And there's a term called sardonic grin. And I don't know if it's true or not, but the story that I read was that it was from an actual event in Sardinia where people moved into an area that had that water hemlock. And it's a common plant here now, too. But they thought it was parsnip, and they ate it. And when they found them, they all had the Joker, grin, like the story of the Joker falling in the acid. And they're all, but yeah, it's I tell that one to the school kids, and they say, "I'm never eating anything in the wild again."
Seriously.
But like I said, it's just a very, very tiny handful, and there's not. I just can't really even think of another plant right offhand that could kill you in a few bites. That's
gotcha.
it.
So the
literally.
overwhelming majority of the stuff that you would find in the Ozarks would be an edible plant.
Yeah.
But the rule of thumb, like you're saying, is don't eat it unless you know what the heck it is.
I tell people there's a lot of stuff that is so easily identified that you're not going to mistake it for something else.
Yeah.
But if it is something, that's why when I wrote my books, I put a lot of detail into the description.
Yeah.
And what we did, Rachel is with West, is another forager she's a wild food chef. And she started putting together these forager certification courses that we did. We've done them 2 years now. But when we certified them on 20 plants, on 10 natives and 10 non-natives, and we would have them sit by the plant and read that description line by line and look at what the book was describing as you see it on the plant. So I'm learning people don't read the front material, they don't read the back material, they usually don't even read the descriptions, they look at the dang pictures.
But people like picture books.
Yeah, but I tell people to sit down and if you think it's that plant, just go line by line, and you'll come to a point where you'll say, okay, that's got to be it, because all these things add up. And then pretty soon you'll say, well, it's got this, but I'm not seeing this on the plant. So but I tell people to get 3 independent confirmations.
Okay.
So if you think it's something, look it up in the book. You can always go, there's like Missouri Wild Food Foraging Facebook group. There's a whole bunch of different national plant groups. There's Missouri Native Plant Society. There's Missouri Mycological Society for mushrooms. So there's all these online sources. There's plant apps now. There's mushroom apps. Don't trust those things. They're, especially as for an only confirmation. But it's a tool. It's just one more little tool in your bag of tricks that you can use to help cement your ID. But a lot of it is just the dirt time, just spending time out there, familiarizing yourself. You don't even have to know what a plant is, but if it's something that catches your eye, spend time with it so you recognize it each time. Then, like I said, when you do run across it in the book, you can look it up, and once you know its name, you got to Google. You can find out everything about that plant that human beings know. And so it's it's how important is it to you to learn it?
Pretty
And that's
important.
how
I don't
much
wanna die.
time you'll spend.
Right. Exactly.
But like I said, you guys are out
Yeah.
hunting and fishing. There's absolutely no reason why you're not coming home with pocketfuls of green. I always take those Walmart plastic bags in my
Yeah.
It's probably the worst thing, but I carry those because it's nothing I have to carry extra. It fits in my back pocket. And if I do find a big pile of greens or a big bag of mushrooms on my way in and out of the woods, I
They're
can
loaded.
just pull that out. And
That was my other question. So the first, majority edible. Second one was, majority is edible, but then be careful, know your stuff.
yeah.
Second question is, how difficult would it be to hunt, fish, and forage a whole year of food in the Ozarks?
Talk
That's a
to
good question.
And that's
Kyle.
all you're doing.
Good
talk,
question.
Talk to Karen and God, I'm drawing a blank on his name. They're a couple out in Oklahoma, and they did exactly that. They grew. They lived an entire year on stuff from their farm and foraged material.
Really?
Hmm.
Yeah.
In Oklahoma.
Yeah, I'll. But if you Google Karen, I think it's Karen Smith, Johnny and Karen Smith.
Okay.
And they have a farm. They have a business that they run off that, and they do permaculture. And like I said, they grow. But they did that for a year and wrote and documented it.
How if you
So-
didn't have a farm and you were in the Ozarks, how tricky
Well,
would that be?
You could do it, but think about, we were never an isolated single person going out and doing these activities. We're always a tribe, a group, a hunter-gatherer group or whatever. So you've got seven, whoever's the best hunter is going to be out there hunting while and a lot of times it was the men were the hunters and the women were the foragers, but everybody did everything.
Yeah.
You
You'd be
know,
a
so-
basket weaver, Kyle.
Yeah.
I don't know about that.
Well, you
Maybe
got to,
so.
you
Fire
got to,
starter.
you can't just
Tender.
you can't just carry your stuff out in your arms. If you're going to go out and forage, you got to have something to carry your stuff in. So,
Dang right. You need a basket.
That's
Kyle.
and a
That's why you
well-made
need- that's why you
basket
need
at that.
a well-made basket.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna do it, you'd have to have a community of people doing it.
Yeah.
I'd
Split
say
the load.
it could be done, but it would be work, and you would have to dehydrate. You're talking about doing it primitively or with modern.
Yeah, I guess.
So if you had a freezer,
I guess with modern.
if you had a freezer, and
I'm thinking like bucket list item for me at some point.
Like
Yeah.
do a whole
if
year.
I said I'm going to do a year of it, how
Yeah.
feasible would it be? Knowing that I have a freezer, I can freeze my venison. I can,
Yeah.
I could, dehydrate the stuff I forage. But
Yeah.
how difficult would it be?
it could be done. It could be
done.
if you had the knowledge that's in that book. If you knew every plant in that book, and that book is just scratching the surface of
Mhm.
there's so many plants I wanted to put in that I just, when you write for somebody like Falcon, you don't write the book you write the book they give you space and time for.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And but just even what's in that book would give you the base of, and then like I said, you'd have to dehydrate, freeze, whatever, and just a lot of it you're going to be eating just on the spot. But also, I quit hunting about 8 years ago, and I still have a freezer full of venison at any given time. I started picking up roadkill. It's legal in Missouri. You can pick up roadkill as long as you call them within 48 hours. They'll send you the paperwork. You legally can have it transported, whatever.
So you're foraging your venison.
Oh yeah,
No way.
That's
yeah.
amazing.
Do you not get worried about it? Like it's been there for a while and all that?
I had I teach at these big primitive skills gatherings out west, and there was one. The first one I went to about 25 years ago was a rabbit stick in Idaho, and a guy there. He was a computer IT guy, but his whole passion was this primitive skill stuff, and his name was Roadkill because he got into the science of how bad meat is before it's actually dangerous. If spoiled meat killed people, we would never survived as a species before refrigeration.
Yeah.
Wow.
You go to any third world country and they've got, it's 90, 100-degree day out and they've got big hunks of meat that's been out there for 4 or 5 days or whatever. And meat the rule is if it smells good, it's good.
Mm-hmm.
And I find roadkill that has been out there for like sometimes a week and a half, 2 weeks, and moderately not cold temperatures, pulled the skin off and the outer skin is kind of green. Well, you cut about an inch into the meat, past that exterior stuff that's kind of, getting spoiled looking, cut into where it's red, cut a little piece of that out, get it away from the stinking carcass and smell it. If it smells bad, then I wouldn't eat it. But if you get it out and it smells like meat, it's good.
Bo.
So that's the rule.
Unbelievable. So you're foraging your own roadkill.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And yes, you can carve away enough meat that, like, the internal stuff will be fine.
Yeah.
That makes sense because historically,
You're just brave.
kill an animal, then you're bringing it back to camp, and camp's
Well, it's
weeks
not just,
away from where your family is. You got to eat it. You got to figure out how to get it there. But
but it's an informed bravery. I'm not just casting the dice, and
That's fair.
But and it's based on a lot of these being around these primitive people that are living that way.
They've
yeah.
done the
PSA:
research.
This is not an advice podcast. So don't go do anything that we're talking about. There's no legal. You cannot hold us legally bound. To
We
anything.
release all liability
all
as we speak
liability
now.
on this.
Well, it's in the
unreal.
book right off the bat.
Yeah, sure.
It's the Falcon puts that in there.
Yeah, it's called "Eat at Your Own Risk."
Yeah, exactly. So, but that's been my rule ever since I've learned about from that guy, and squirrels, rabbits, whatever's on the road. If it hadn't been there too long, if it's not mashed flat, there's almost always something good you can pull off of it. And,
Well, and if you're driving the same roads too, you're going to know what's been there and what's not. Like that's a new deer that just happened to be hit right there.
Makes me feel better about the deer that you're like, it may have sat just a little too long.
Yeah.
You're probably right.
Yeah, it was a little bit too
well,
warm for that
and everybody,
24 hours.
what do people when you shoot a deer? Do you just go and eat it immediately, or do you hang it?
No,
I eat it immediately, whole thing.
Oh, I hang it.
No, I'm just kidding. It
Well,
hangs.
I mean, So what are you doing
in the woods?
Yeah, the whole thing.
Plunkett's
Sit
out
down
there
and
gnawing
eat
on
it.
the neck bone in the woods.
What are you doing when you hang it? What are you doing?
Yeah.
It's a controlled rot.
Yeah, that's fair.
You're aging it. You're breaking down the fibers. You're making it more tender.
Aging is a civilized way of saying controlled rot.
Controlled rot.
Sure.
Exactly.
But I guess I would say it's controlled, and I'm making sure that it's staying under like 40 degrees.
Yeah, and I'm controlling when I'm doing it too. If it's an early season deer, it's going straight to the fridge.
Yeah.
And then or processed by myself and straight to the freezer.
Yeah.
But if it's a cold November deer, there's been times I'll let a deer
That's true.
hang with the skin off for days.
Yeah.
Well,
deer hunting.
what happens is that as the skin dries, it develops, the old timers called it a cuticle, where it just dries hard, and the flies can't even lay eggs on it. They call it fly blow. They can't even get on there to lay eggs on the thing. And if they do, you just scrape them off. You're going to cook the thing anyway, So there's a lot of evils that are done away with by cooking things.
Yes.
Just like with mushrooms. All wild mushrooms have toxins. You really have to cook them well. Even morel mushrooms make people sick every year. Morels killed a whole group of people. I think it was last year up in the Northwest. They were farmed morels that had been shipped from China.
Uh-oh.
And people were suspect of, God, they sent us bad stuff. But a whole bunch of other restaurants that served the very same mushrooms didn't have any issue. It was one restaurant, and they undercooked them.
And they undercooked
Yeah,
them.
so
Wow.
So you do have to take pains in some things about preparing them to where you're sure that there's no. And that's probably the most commonly eaten mushroom.
Oh,
And
yeah.
some people, even with that, under the best of circumstances, there's going to be something out there that is going to give you a reaction that 99.99% of the rest of the population not going to bother.
Yeah.
So that's another advice that I say on plants and mushrooms or any of that kind of stuff. The first time you're eating new species of anything, especially if you've got a history of any kind of allergies, take a very little bit the first time. Just not a helping, just a sample, little bite. And
see what it does for you.
And wait 24 hours, and then if that doesn't, and then with mushroom, well, there's the big, they call it big red mushroom. They call them false morels.
Yeah.
To this day, MDC says that's a toxic mushroom. And there's a site called False Morels Demystified on Facebook, and it's a bunch of mycologists that actually did the work. They did they found a new way to test for the toxin, which is gyrometrin, I think is how it's pronounced. But it's got monomethylhydrazine, which breaks down into something they make rocket fuel from.
Oh.
So it's very toxic, and it can collapse your liver. But that's one species that they eat And the name, and like I said, the Latin names, the name of this, the one that's the most toxic is called Gyrometer esculenta, and it's a European species. But they sell it in stores. They can it. They eat it. But you got to boil it before you cook it. And they even see boiling it. You got to boil it in an open space that's not closed in. The vapors can even make you sick.
Oh wow!
But the name of that is esculenta, and in Latin, esculenta means fit for the table or good to eat.
Oh wow!
And so
it's in the name that you can eat this.
But
thing.
the one that's here, we don't have that here in Missouri.
Okay.
It's never been found in this part of the country. And now the more they find out about it, the more that the ones of that same species that they thought were in the United States is not even that actual species, and the level of toxins are way lower than the ones in Europe.
Gotcha.
Interesting.
But the one that's here, they call it Big Red. It's really convoluted. Do you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
the false morel. Yeah.
Yeah. That one it's Gyrometer caroliniana. And actually, they've even changed the Latin of that. Now I think it's Neogyrometer. But anyway, that one is no more toxic than a morel. You just cook it well, and I think they're better than a morel.
Really?
And they're enormous. They get these giant, just foot tall things.
So you eat them regularly?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Whenever I find them, and it's just
That's amazing.
yeah. And anytime you mention that mushroom on a page of any kind, it starts the argument of
Oh, yeah,
you're
I
going to
see
kill
it.
yourself,
The
you're going to blow up your liver, and
Yeah.
and all these. Well, my family's been eating them all my life, and so there's always that argument. But science is, the guys that actually do this for a living have looked into it, so it's.
You just got to make sure you cook them well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That makes sense.
It's like anything. You got to know what you're doing with it.
Yeah.
I would eat a deer, rare, no problem. But
Oh,
if
yeah.
I've got a buddy who's like, well, I'm cooking this bear to 125, I'm like, I'm not touching that.
Yeah.
I don't want trichinosis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same,
You gotta know what you're
I'm not
gonna
going to eat a raw morel or a raw false morel, but
Yeah.
fry it up right. It's like, okay, it's different.
Yeah.
Man, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good, Bo. We appreciate you. Thanks for being on the show. If you're listening, go find some greens out in your yard.
I might plug
Read the book, maybe.
I might plug my website.
Yeah.
It's my name and
So Bo Brown?
Yep. Foraging. BoBrownForaging.com.
Okay.
All right.
So the website that's on the back of the book, it got hacked and it's no longer active. It's the website, firstearth.org for my First Earth Wilderness School.
Okay.
So that site's down and you can't get to it
Oh,
from
no
there.
way.
Yeah. So I'm just shifting everything to BoBrownForaging.com.
BoBrownForaging.com.
That's the place to
great.
go.
Yep.
Don't go anywhere. We're gonna have Bo back on the show, and we're gonna be talking about Stone Age tools, primitive skills, and Bo, I know you do a lot of stuff on this and demonstrations up at Dogwood Canyon and other places like that. And so, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, flint napping, anything like that, we're going to be talking about that on the next episode. So, thank you guys for tuning in, and we will
Thank
see you on the next one.